Okay, my friends, good evening. And if you would like to follow up with that Chava Alberstein Chad Gadya, I assume that the message is clear, and I think it's really important for us to reflect on, especially now that we are experiencing this outrageous violence in a number of places in the world, and most particularly in Ukraine. But the Israelis have experienced terror in the last few days. So it's something that we need to reflect on. I'm sure that part of the way in which the Ikar is focused and ritual is always a means by which we remind ourselves constantly of what's important to us to be involved with. Let me introduce what I'm going to do today, and I also hope that you'll have some questions. Perhaps, I mean, if you have some more immediate questions, you can interrupt me, and I'll try to finish and give some time at the end of our shiur. I'm not always so adept at doing that, but I'm gonna work on it. We're talking about the plagues, we're talking about COVID, and I think we have to keep in our mind Pharaonic rulers and what the consequence of their arbitrary pursuit of power. And I call it arbitrary because it's the pursuit of power for the sake of power, but not for and for themselves rather than for any other good. And it's catastrophic, destructive, and we've seen it over the course of human history, and we're watching it today. So I think we have to sort of keep that in the back of our minds as we think about the plagues and the plague narrative. So let me tell you how I first began my interest in dealing with this subject a couple of years ago in this particular manner. I was reading these articles that focused on religious teachers who were finding all these explanations for the pandemic, that, as to why God was bringing about this pandemic at this particular time. There were Christian ministers, evangelists, and there were rabbis using all forms of Jewish interpretation, including numerology and forms of association to make claims about what particular sins humans were guilty of that would bring about this epidemic. It hurts me when I see this form of discourse, these types of sort of religious assertions. It undermines religion, it undermines science, and it undermines society. We can't function in this fashion. And it recalls what we might want to see as magic. In other words, people are prone to believe, to be susceptible to magical explanations because there's a need to be able to feel that we're in control. One of the consequences of this epidemic is that we sensed our lack of control. And I hope we can hold on to that. Because indeed, we are not in control. We're only human beings. And maybe I can stop here and say, we've learned our lesson, that's it. How can we learn that, right? I mean, really, it's so fundamental and we don't know it because we keep on trying, to gain control of everything. And without this recognition that it's not possible. We'll come back to this. We'll come back to that as we move on. So the other question that I had that I raised in the little blurb that was sent out to you was, why it was necessary for God to pull out all of God's stuff in order to defeat Pharaoh. I mean, one plague would have been sufficient. And in fact, it might have been sufficient for God to simply arrange for the Exodus without any plagues. What are any plagues for? what we thought was redemption. All right, so it was sort of an added drama. I guess it makes a story, it makes a good movie, perhaps. So what is that? What is that really all about? Why? What is the meaning? What's the inner meaning, as I said, of the plagues? Now, so this started me on an assessment of what our tradition has to say about reward and punishment. It's something that I've thought about for a long time. It's not something that just came in the last few years, because the way in which we normally explain the Egyptian narrative is that Pharaoh was sinned, Egypt enslaved, and Egypt was punished by God. I mean, that's the simple explanation, and it plays into sort of a normal religious dynamic that if humans err, they have to be corrected, and one of the means of correction is some form of divine intervention, and God intervenes to push us back on our way. We're off the path. We need to be pushed back onto the path. Now, that's a very hard notion I think, for those of us who are moderns to accept. And when we know a little bit about science, or we should know at least a little bit about science. Moreover, lately, I haven't seen God intervening too much, not for the good and not for the bad. In fact, maybe not only lately, for the last couple thousand years, there haven't been too many interventions. So how do we translate classical religious discourse and understand it in such a way that we can still make it meaningful to us? That's the dilemma. I think that's a sort of a central religious undertaking for a religious teacher, to take classical texts that speak in another dialect, or they speak out of a different context with different understandings, and be able to extract from that meaning and frame our own contemporary lives and see it as still teaching us something and be of relevance. Right? That's apart from the fact, of what I mentioned about, the trouble that people have with simply discussing the plagues. I mean, really, it just sounds, and especially the 10th plague, sounds really overwhelming, and not godly, not becoming of God to be so destructive. We thought we finished with that with a flood, and here we have this destruction that's described in Egypt, and it's sort of another flood, right? They drown in the sea. It's a mini flood story. Now, this idea of reward and punishment is something that we confront daily, at least once, or at least, for those who pray traditionally, twice. Anybody, maybe someone wants to interrupt and just shout out, where do we confront this classical notion of reward and punishment in our daily prayers? And it's central to our daily prayers. It's not something that's esoteric. Someone want to unmute and just let us know?
The Amida, I think.
The Amida, well, we do get an intimation of that, but in other words, I'm thinking about something where it actually says, if you do this, you'll get this, and if you do that, you won't get. And if you behave
the Shema, I think the
Shema.
Yeah.
Exactly, the Shema. The second paragraph of the Shema tells us that if you observe the mitzvot, it'll rain. If you don't observe the mitzvot, there'll be a drought, and you'll be banished from the land. Now, I mean, again, we say it every day. It's part of the central recitation of our prayer service. What do we mean by this? Do you really think that if you do the mitzvot, it's going to rain? So, I think we should do a lot of mitzvot here in California, and the problem, by the way, is maybe we shouldn't, because if we do a lot of mitzvot, then we're going to see that it's not going to rain anyway. And then we'll stop doing any mitzvot, because we'll say, it doesn't work. So, I mean, is this really what religion is? Something that works, that you press a button, God says, okay, I'll do it because, you've worshiped me. So how do we understand it? Now, by the way, you have to deal with the fact that there are two paragraphs in the Shema. And the first paragraph doesn't say a word, not a word about observing the mitzvot, nor about reward and punishment. The first paragraph talks in terms of love. So let's just begin this, because this is how Maimonides frames it in a way. The first paragraph is about love, and the second paragraph, I would say, is the relationship of fear, right? In other words, the relationship is, if I observe or I'm religiously devoted, because that will protect me, and if I'm not religiously devoted, I will not have that protection. In fact, something bad might happen to me. Now, that's a motivation, apart from the fact that I was critical of this, that is a motivation of a lot of people. So I do want to, let's read a little bit here in the first section of the text that I have. I'm going to share my screen. Hold on a second, everybody. And, okay, and can everybody see that? Can you see that? Sarah, can you shake your head? You can. Okay. All right. So the first section in the sources is taken from Maimonides' discussion of the laws of Teshuva in his law code in the Mishnah Torah. I want to say a word about the Mishnah Torah, just so that you have a sense. The Mishnah Torah is a unique corpus of law, because the Rambam he achieved this. He was able to sneak in, wherever possible, some philosophic reflection in a law code. It's unique in that fashion. I doubt that there are many law codes there are 14 books in the Mishnah Torah. The first book is called Sefer Hamada. It's a book of philosophy that introduces the law, because to Maimonides, the law without philosophy is meaningless. You need to know why you're doing things, and you need to know what the ultimate purpose is. So you have to have a framework. So this is a prejudice that I share, I must say, and that I think that that's how we have to approach, in general, Jewish observance, by searching for what the meaning is and what we're trying to instill and what we're trying to incorporate into our lives. It's not the practice. It's what the practice should bring us to. The practice is a means. Right? So the last section of the first book of Maimonides' Law Code is devoted to Teshuvah. It's the first time, by the way, that anybody has attempted to organize Teshuvah in this type of legal frame that Maimonides does, and present it as a bunch of postulates that you need to follow. In the last chapter, he reflects on the nature of what is religious devotion. And he says, "Let no person say, excuse the gender, behold, I perform the precepts of the Torah and engage myself in its wisdom so that I will receive all the blessings described therein." No, you don't devote yourself religiously for any ulterior motive, or so that I will merit the life in the world to come. I mean, not even, you don't even do these things to get a religious reward, for nothing, right? That's not why. You need to be committed in an uncontingent manner. That's the goal. "And I will separate myself from the transgressions against which the Torah gave warning, so that I will escape the curses described therein, or so that I will suffer excision from the life in the world, so that I will not suffer excision in life in the world to come. It is improper to serve God in such way. For whoever serves God in such a way, such a person is a worshiper because of fear, which is neither the degree of the prophets," meaning it has no religious significance, right? Because it's not seriously, sincerely religious, because you're doing it because you want to gain, not because of any devotion. It's for yourself that you're doing it. "And nor the degree of the sages." It's neither religiously significant, nor is it a function of reason. There's no reason involved. You can't explain this in a rational way. "And the Lord should not be worshipped, God should not be worshipped that way, save only by ignorant men, women, and infants, who are trained to worship because of fear, until their knowledge increases, when they will worship because of love." So already Maimonides gives an intimation here that religious devotion is part of an educational process. And although as children we might begin with a childlike sense of fear, we have to graduate. We have to graduate religiously. Most of us haven't graduated religiously. Right? We've been retarded or impaired, I'm sorry, better, impaired by our educators and the lack of education, and we're stuck. So we have to be able to move. What does Maimonides continue to say? The worshiper, because of love, engages oneself in the study of the Torah and the observance of precepts and follows the paths of wisdom on no account in the world, neither for fear of evil nor in order to inherit the good, but does the true thing because it is true. And in the end, the good comes because thereof. You don't do it to get the good, you do it because it's good. And because you have a sense that by doing the good, by aspiring to virtue and reflecting virtue in the world, is transformative. And there will be a good result ultimately from people who aspire to virtue. That degree is a great degree indeed, and not every scholar attains it. That's a little bit of Rambam's, I think, the commentaries say it's Maimonides' critique of Aristotle. Not every rational scholar attains the degree that he's of actually doing good for its own sake. For such was the degree of Abraham, our father, whom the Holy One called God's beloved, because Abraham worshipped not save because of love. In other words, only because of love. And it is furthermore the degree concerning which the Holy One commanded through Moses, saying, "And you shall love the Lord your God." So the primary commandment is in the first paragraph of the Shema that says, "V'ahavta et Hashem Elokecha," you shall love the Lord your God. But for when humans love the Lord, love God with a proper love, God will momentarily, will momentarily perform all of the commandments because of love. In other words, what has to emanate from your heart is a sense of devotion that's linked to an understanding that I need to do good in the world because I'm a human being created with that capacity to do good. And if I do good and others do good, it will have an impact on the nature of the whole social realm in which we live. It'll transform the world in that way. It'll reverberate beyond us. So we have to cultivate and nurture that sense within us that allows us to be idealistic in the way in our actions. Not so easy. Not so easy. We all do things because we expect to get something for doing them. How do we train ourselves to do things that are not simply for the sake of gain? Now, religion, by the way, is a very good training ground because there is rarely a direct link, unless you happen to be looking for it, between what you do and what you get. So religion is a good place, I think, from a rational perspective, to learn how to do things for which you don't get any reward, because you don't see any immediate reward in what you do. And so it allows you to understand how to be a human being and be a good human being, even though you don't necessarily gain in normal terms from that, other than what you gain is the sense that you're doing good, which is an enormous gain, by the way. So the last paragraph in this chapter, I've selected 3 out of the, I think there are 5 or 6 paragraphs. Maimonides writes the following. This is key. One who engages oneself in the study of the Torah in order to receive a reward or in order to prevent oneself from being overtaken by punishment is one who studies the Torah not for its own sake, but one who studies it neither because of fear nor because of reward, but because of love of God, of the God of the whole earth, who commanded concerning it, is one who studies it for its own sake. Therefore, when instructions are given to infants, I'm going to skip this because it's not worth even mentioning, are given to infants and the ignorant in general, they should not be instructed save to worship because of fear until their knowledge will increase and they will become wise in wisdom when the secret is revealed to them little by little, and get them acquainted with the subject slowly until they will attain and know it, when they will serve God because of love. So Maimonides is aware and conscious of human weakness and of human tendency, and he cannot allow himself to demand the ideal from everyone, right, immediately. Because to demand the ideal from everyone immediately is to undermine the very quest itself, because people aren't going to be able to do it. So you need to move them to this point gradually, to educate them. And you have to move them along the continuum. That's the obligation of the teacher, to allow them to rise beyond mere contingency. And I perform because I have a motive, an ulterior motive, and how I can get to a point of idealism. And you need to constantly work on it, because we fall back very easily into a pattern of only doing things that yield immediate gratification or some sense of reward. Now, what he says here that I think that I interpret, now again, my interpretation, I'm not going to foist it on you as being the interpretation, but when he says here, they should, so first of all, I'm sorry, the principle, it's a rabbinic principle, mitoch shelo lishma ba lishma, better that you should be involved in religious life, even if it's not for its own sake, because if you do things not for their own sake, hopefully you'll be able to emerge and grow to the point of doing things for their own sake. Now that's the prejudice here, that actions are significant. In fact, if I could go, I don't want to take too much more time on this. Habit is important in this, in performing, and out of that habit, if you become a virtuoso in the way in which you habitually perform something, you begin to think about the inner meaning of what you're doing, and then go and transcend your own personal gain in your commitment. So Rambam says, and they will become wise in wisdom when this secret is revealed to them little by little. What's the secret? I'll tell you what I think the secret is. The secret is that Maimonides and others, I think Gersonides, Ralbag, they knew that there really wasn't any reward and punishment. But they couldn't say it, because you can't say that. What's his name? Strauss. What was Strauss's first name? The philosopher Leo Strauss wrote a very important article called "Persecution and the Art of Writing," that philosophers learned from Socrates that you don't say everything because you pay for it. So what you need to do is you need to say things in ways in which that those who are wise and who can decode what you're saying will understand, but others may not comprehend immediately. And if you read Maimonides' introduction to the Guide for the Perplexed, he talks about 7 modes of contradiction that he utilizes in presenting his ideas in the Guide for the Perplexed. And it's clear that he's setting you up, because he doesn't expect you to understand everything so simply, and that you have to work through it. And it's not, even after you work through it, it's not clear. So perhaps I just want to say, perhaps he means to say that the real religious secret is that that God is not busy up there or wherever God is, manipulating nature and making things happen and making the water split or making this happen and so on. That's not what God does, right? We are responsible, not God. And I want to push this idea forward. Now, the way in which Maimonides establishes it, I'm not going to read this passage, just tell you, you can read it yourselves. He distinguishes it between what he calls necessary opinions and correct opinions. You see there where he says necessary, and he says, in some cases, the commandment communicates a correct belief, and here you have what's called a necessary belief. So a correct belief is the truth that we're pursuing. The necessary opinion is what's necessary to teach the masses of people as a step in their development to be able to comprehend and grasp the correct opinion. So there are many opinions presented religiously and teachings that we were all taught when we were children, but nobody ever went ahead and said, okay, now you're grown up or you're growing. How can you outgrow your dependency on these crutches in order for you to be able to continue to be committed, to be a religious person or a good person? I mean, that's all, but clearly a religious person without that crutch, without thinking that I'm doing it because God's watching me and God's going to come in and do these things for me. So that's a necessary opinion that we need to outgrow. That's how I would That's how I would describe that. All right. So any questions up till now? I mean, if there anybody who has a question, I can take it at this point.
I have a question.
Go ahead. Who's that?
My name is Regina.
Shalom,
Kathy.
Regina.
Shalom.
Hi.
Thank you for the teaching. I have a question. So there are laws which require, it's like an act of faith. You know, you do them
Yes.
because you're instructed, and then hopefully, you know, the outcome will be good later, you know, but I think a lot of people have a problem getting.
Regina, 1 second, excuse me, I'm sorry.
Sure.
What the work you need to do, it is to try to come to an understanding of what this observance is supposed to induce within you. It's about, I mean, the bottom line, there is a goal here. The goal is to build character. And
okay.
And we have to keep up in everything, including ritual matters, Shabbat. I mean, I can go through. We don't have time to do this, but that's the task of us, of religious teachers and of religious people to understand those elements. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I thank you very much, and it really does depend on how you're taught. You know, because some of it's just ritualistic, and it depends how you integrate that into your understanding.
Right. So remember, God says about Abraham that God is going to share with Abraham the fate of the Sodomites, and God says why? Because I know that Abraham will raise his children and educate them in b'derech Hashem la'asot tzedakah u'mishpat, in the way of God, to do righteousness and justice. So in other words, the way of God is not to do ritual. The way of God is righteousness and justice. So ritual serves the purpose of producing righteous and just people. Hopefully. We don't see that. Okay. All right.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right. So so the first point is that I challenge or a question to the whole classical notion of reward and punishment. All right, so let's sort of hold this back. Second proposition here is the link between nature and ethics and human morality. And it's kind of amazing. I'm sorry that I haven't translated this, but I'll read it for you and translate a line or two. This is by Rabbi Cook. So Rabbi Cook says, Torah Yisrael מבארת איך קיום העולם והמוסר האנושי הם תלויים זה בזה. The teaching of Israel, he means that by Torah Yisrael, he means the great, in writ large, the teachings of Judaism teach us, explains that that sustaining the world and human morality are dependent one on the other. וממילא מובן ששכלול העולם בשכלול המוסר גם הוא קשור קשר של קיימא. And what he understands is sort of the perfection and the improvement of the world. Is all tied in to the way to human moral behavior in a tie that sustains it. That's a sustaining, an essential dimension of sustaining the world. Zoti ikar dat Elohim HaYisraelit. This is an essential teaching, an essential principle of Israelite religiosity. Cheta Adam kilkel bechlalo et musaro ad shemala haaretz chamas. This is fantastic. The sin of human beings, kilkel, what's a good translation? Messed up. In general, human morality, until the earth was filled with violence. Okay, so what Rav Kook is saying is when Genesis describes that the flood came about because Mal'ah ha'aretz Hamas, the world was filled with violence, Genesis is actually telling us that the flood came about not because God brought the flood upon human beings, but because humans destroy the world through their behavior. The story is told by attributing ultimacy to God. That's the mode of religious teaching in general. In other words, religious teaching generally presents God as the cause. But God as the cause, I would propose to you, is always the ultimate cause and not the immediate cause. Meaning, since God is the creator, everything ultimately is attributable to God. But the actual event that occurs is not something that God brings about in that moment. We bring it about in that moment. We are endowed with this godlike possibility and potential. We bring about the destruction. So the Hamas, that was the characteristic of the human behavior before the flood. That was what was responsible. Human violence was what was responsible for undermining the possibility of human existence, because that's what Rav Kook says. Human existence is contingent and dependent upon human morality. So our moral conscience, our moral behavior has consequences for the way in which the world is able to be sustained. So that's the beginning of a discussion of what's going on in the V'hayam Shamoa chapter. Which now I want you to think about this for a moment. That if I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but I think it'll help us because we don't have all that much time. That if you let's take for instance human arrogance. If you believe that everything is here on earth is here for you to utilize, because you are the end goal of human creation. You're a human being, and in the hierarchy, it's there to serve your needs. Right? So if you have that impulse, then what you're going to do is not only mistreat other human beings because you think of yourself as being ultimately important, you'll also abuse the resources around you because all the resources were created to serve you. So moral sensitivity means being sensitive to who you are and what your place in the world is, how you relate to other human beings, and how you relate to the natural world. Do you have respect for the natural world? Or is the natural world only there in order to serve your needs and help you achieve your personal goals? So maintaining some sense of balance is critical to sustaining the world itself. So Rav Kook introduces us to that conversation. Kenneth Seeskin, in his book on idolatry, it's a wonderful little book, so it helps us understand a little bit more what idolatry is in contemporary terms, because it's not simply worshiping stones. That's not really what the prophets are attacking or criticizing. Let's read this together. Let us now take stock. Idolatry is not an isolated act, but rather a comprehensive worldview, according to which nothing is unique and everything can be measured or conceived in human terms. It's all about us. The purpose of Judaism or any monotheistic religion is to persuade people to abandon this worldview and adopt one in which humans are not the measure of all things, but are created and ruled over by God, according to Isaiah. In other words, God is necessary, not for you to believe in God. God is necessary for you to know that you're not God, and that there's something beyond. You have to have a sense that you're not the measure of all things. Because if you believe that you're the measure of all things and that there is sort of no control beyond you, you'll do anything because you can. You have license. By God, he means something of ultimate value, something that is worthy of worship or adoration. God, in turn, cannot be seen, controlled, or completely understood, To believe in God is to stand in awe of something that is not only greater than you, but greater than anything you can imagine. So have you cultivated a transcendent sense in your life? That's something that you try to reach for, that you're not there yet, and that you're always yearning to achieve. That's the trick of religion. Religion is not something that you achieve. You're always aspiring to achieve it. And that's the way in which you maintain your constant search and not believe that I'm there. Because once you believe you're there, you're defeated. And you defeated the purpose of being a religious human being. And it's always the question of sustaining the quest for the unknowable. That's why, I mean, that's what's so distinctive about the effort of the Bible to begin to introduce this notion of an unknowable God. Now, in addition to Rabbi Kook's presentation, people know that Rabbi Kook was the first chief rabbi of Palestine. He was appointed during the British Mandate, and he was a poet and a mystic and the halachic authority and a really and in many ways very progressive, in other ways problematic. But we can't go in that direction today. But he did have some wonderful insights, religious insights, and we have this proposition about the nature of idolatry. I'm not going to take us through this text. It's a little bit of a gift to you. I'll tell you what it says. Basically, this is a text written in the 14th century by a Maimonidean philosopher named Joseph ibn Kaspi, who came from Arjan in Provence, and he had a naturalistic understanding of human nature. Humans are part of a natural continuum. I think there are a few lines that I think are important here. Let's take this one right here. He says, above all, we are bidden to be compassionate to all other human beings. He's commenting on the passage in Deuteronomy regarding the need to send the mother bird away. So before you take the baby bird. So he's trying to introduce a rational understanding of what this is really all about. And then he says, the ultimate is to be compassionate to other human beings. Next in order come our relations with the animals, which we are only allowed to slaughter in an approved manner when thy soul desires flesh, since we were originally designed to be vegetarian, as stated in Genesis. I think that he himself was a vegetarian. It was only after the flood that the consumption of meat became widespread, which is tantamount, listen to this, to eating our parent, since it is nearest to our substance. When I read that, I mean, that blew my mind. Because when I went to yeshiva, what they constantly told us was, do you think that you're a descendant of a monkey? How could that be? That's ridiculous. I want to tell you something. Not only is it not ridiculous, it's something essential to our understanding that there is a continuum of a relationship between us and all of nature itself. And that we shouldn't be so arrogant to worship ourselves, the worst form of idolatry, by the way, self-worship, self-adoration in that regard, and recognize who we are in relationship to the grand nature of nature itself. And to develop a sense of not only of respect, but of love and of sensitivity to the natural world in which we live. It was only right since it is nearest to our substance. For this reason, the Torah commanded us to show pity to them, not slaughter, etc. In a descending scale comes the precepts governing the plant world. There are not so stringent. So there is a bit of a hierarchy, because the ultimate, it is true. What the Torah, Ibn Kaspi would say, is most concerned with is about humans, the way humans treat other humans. Hopefully, if they develop a sensitivity to the natural world, then they will hopefully maintain a high degree of sensitivity to other human beings. That's really what this is about, he says. But in the process, we need to understand that we too are part of nature. We are part of nature, not apart from nature, right? So that when we hurt nature, we're hurting ourselves. Do we think that way? Or do we think we can get away with it because we're in control of nature? So Ibn Kasmi says, don't think you're in control of nature. That's what creation is about. All of you were created by God. No, nothing is in control of the other. There's only in religious language, we say God is in control, whatever that means. But we're not the ones who are pulling the strings here. We are forbidden to cut down fruit trees, etc., etc. And he says even inanimate objects are inert matter is also alive in nature. We know that here in California, that rocks are alive, right? We know that very well. To conclude, the Torah inculcates in us a sense of our modesty and lowliness. That's the message, that we should be ever cognizant of the fact that we are the same stuff as the ass and the mule, the cabbage and the pomegranate, and even the lifeless stone. Okay, that's one of the great teachings that I've come across. Okay, now getting to the Exodus, getting to Pharaoh. What's going on here in the Exodus story? What's happened? The problem in the Exodus story is Pharaoh's pharaonic arrogance. And it's no better presented than in this wonderful midrash of the encounter between Pharaoh and Moses and Aaron. Moses and Aaron come to see Pharaoh. I'll summarize parts of the midrash, and they say they're coming as representatives of God, and Pharaoh should release the Israelites. Shalach et ami, let my people go. So Pharaoh says, one second, who's this God who sent you? So they say, it's the God, the creator of the universe. Pharaoh says, what's his name? So they share with him whatever they share with him about the nature of God. And Pharaoh says, I have to check this out. Let me check it out in my books. So Pharaoh has, all his religious tomes, and he looks through his anthology. He has his reference works behind his desk, like I have here on the religions of the world. He pulls out religions of the world, and he looks for, did they know, maybe they gave him Yud-He Vav-He or whatever name they gave him. He looks it up and says, that's not in my book. I don't see that. I don't know that God. I know the God of Moab. I know the God of Aram, right? I know the gods of Egypt. In fact, I know the God of Egypt. I'm the God of Egypt. I know that very well, but I don't know your God. You're phonies. You're fakes. You. Listen to the conversation here. We'll take it here, where he says, whereupon Pharaoh said to them, is he young or old? How old is he? How many cities has he captured? How many provinces has he subdued? How long is it since he ascended to the throne? So you understand that these are all values that Pharaoh attributes to his importance. Look at what I've done. Look at my significance. Look at my power. Look at what I achieved. What is your God? Who's your? Show me concretely what your God has done. They replied, our God's strength and might fill the universe. Before the world was created, God existed, and God will, etc., etc. Moreover, God formed thee and you and has given you the breath of life. He then said to them, what deeds did he perform? Then Moses and Aaron go through a whole list, of God creating and this, etc., with a lot of metaphors, and then Pharaoh responds. His reply to them was, from the very outset, you have spoken falsehood, you Moses and Aaron. For I am the Lord of the universe, and I have created myself and the Nile. As it says, my river is mine own, and I have made it for myself. In Ezekiel, Li Yaori Va'ani Asitani. The Nile is me, and I am the Nile. I made it. Ezekiel in chapter 29, I'm sorry, this is a Hebrew commentary of Samuel David Luzzato on this passage in Ezekiel, where he actually says that the name, I don't know if he knew some Egypt, he knew a little bit of Egyptology, I think already in the 19th century, he knew some, and he says that Pharaoh, the Hebrew Pharaoh, is comprised of the word Ra, and Ra is the sun god, in Egypt. The Resh and Ayin, that might be, but Pharaoh is represented in Ezekiel as the crocodile of the Nile, the great sea monster, the great power, because the Nile is identified with Pharaoh. That you can understand that's one of the reasons that the Nile had to be victimized in the plagues, because it was really an attack on Pharaoh. We'll come to that. We'll come to that in a moment. Now, consistent with this understanding of Ra as the sun god, and of Pharaoh's sense of control that's linked to the array of gods that Pharaoh calls on, and over which, by the way, he has power, right? So Pharaoh, in his conversation with Moses and Aaron, warns them. He says to them, "Ru'u," it's in Exodus 10:10, "Ru'u ki ra'a neged penechem." See and understand that Ra'ah is standing against you. So Rashi already explains this. It's a long this is a long Rashi on this particular passage, where he talks about some association with a star and so on and so forth, which I don't want to read into now, but I want to read a line in Umberto Cassuto's commentary, which I think is really right on, and I'll translate. Cassuto, by the way, you can also find in English if you look for his commentary. He was a modern Italian rabbi who was a professor at the Hebrew University in Bible, and a great scholar of the ancient Near East. Yesh lerot me'ein remez la'el hamitzri ra. In this passage where Pharaoh declares Ra'ah is standing against you, right? You can feel and hear a hint of an Egyptian god, the Egyptian god Ra, El Hashemesh, to the sun, Rosh HaPantheon HaMitzri, the head of the Egyptian pantheon. De'u, says Pharaoh, no, ki koach ha'el shali yakum negdechem. What Pharaoh was telling Moses and Aaron is that my God that I control is going to wreak revenge against you. Yakum negdechem. Re'u ki ra'ah. So Cassuto and Rashi somewhat already understand that the text intimates that the plagues and the confrontation between Pharaoh and Moses and Aaron is a war of the God, the creator God, against the gods of Egypt, and against the God of Egypt, against Pharaoh. This is the war of monotheism against paganism. And the reason for the war is as follows. I mean, that's what I mean. We're not necessarily in favor of war, right? We're not. But what happens is that the plagues become a symbolic way in which the war is waged to undermine a belief system that allows one human being to claim that he is greater than all other human beings, and that he has the right to control their lives, and then he has the right to use the world and nature in any way he wants to. Because what's going to happen if he does so is his ultimate demise. We know this from the history of empires. Every empire self-destructed at some point because of the hubris of the leadership or of the elite in the society. And the story of the Exodus is a story of a hubristic Pharaoh who brings about the destruction of his grand nation and his grand civilization that had been achieved. So one way in which this is represented is by associating all the plagues with a different one of the gods of Egypt. So you see this effort here in this chart, and that what basically what's happening in this plague narrative is that what's being asserted in the Torah is that we need to move beyond a God who is to be found in nature, because that's the pagan belief, and that there are many forces that we worship because nature has enormous power, but there are also human beings who have, because they are forces in nature, there are human beings who have figured out how to control those forces in nature. They're called magicians, or in biblical Egyptian language, hartumim. And Pharaoh is the one who dominates all, and he can use his magicians to control the natural forces, and he himself is the ultimate authority because he is the most powerful. And the nature itself is his servant. And nature, which is his servant, allows him not only to utilize nature to his benefit, but to utilize all the human beings that are in his service, that are his citizens, for his own personal gain, or for the gain of the elite, or from what he thinks, for what he thinks is the gain of Egypt. So he manipulates and both the people and the nature itself. And the story of the Egyptian Exodus is a story of the undermining of that worldview and the self-destruction of the Pharaonic Empire by a monarch whose arrogance did him in, right? By a self-worshiping monarch. Right? So the religious idea that the Torah is aiming at is for a God who's beyond any control. So there's nothing that we can do to make God do anything. That's really what we need to come to, that understanding. Nothing that we could do is going to make God do anything. The Pharaonic system is one in which human beings believed that by virtue of their doing things, they can get gods to do things. And if they had, and the more power they had, the more right, the more they could get the gods to do things for them. So that's one understanding of the plague narrative that I think is helpful, that it's a war between monotheism and paganism, and Israel, the task of Israel, we were designated to be the dragon slayers. Our role was to knock down pagan civilization to size because of its abuse and its pursuit of power. And we need to recognize that it's values that we introduce into the world, not power. Now, I mean, there's a whole discussion about that we can have today about the need to exercise power and how power can be exercised with a sense of moral restraint. But the ultimate value is not power and our control. The ultimate value is reaching beyond the power, right, to the good, and for as the religious purpose. Okay, so that's the first level of understanding. Second level of understanding, which I think is in fact critical and key. It's something that I learned from Tzioni Zevet. I think there are some people here on the call. I don't know if Miriam is still on the call, but Miriam was a colleague of Tzioni's, and Tzioni wrote a series of articles in which he emphasized something that was really astoundingly significant. And that is that there's a direct relationship between the plague narrative and the creation story. And if you look at certain phrases in the creation in the plague story and in the creation narrative, you'll see that they share a linguistic root in common. For instance, when we talk about the fish being created, the phrase in Genesis 1 is Yishritzu hamayim, sheretz, let the water swarm with fish. Where do you hear the term swarm in the plague narrative, right? It's the same term used for the frogs. The frogs are, they're swarming like the fish in creation. So what's happening? Who is Pharaoh? Pharaoh is the ruler of Egypt who undermines and overturns creation. He turns creation into chaos. He turns light into darkness. He turns life into death. He turns the Nile, which is a source of life, into blood. He bleeds the Nile. So if you see the narrative being presented in this way, you understand the narrative as a type of polemic that sets us up to understand what's the Israelite critique of Egyptian society. That the consequence of Pharaonic rule is to turn the world upside down. So again, I just repeat myself. It's not God who brought the plagues on Egypt. It's Pharaoh who ultimately destroyed Egypt itself. It's Pharaoh's behavior that is his and Egypt's undoing. Now, I'm not the first one to say that, neither was Sioni. There are 16th century commentaries, one of which I bring here, this Abraham Saba on page 9. You can, those of you, this source here, source number 12, Saba himself was a Spanish rabbi. I think he spent many of his years in Algeria after the expulsion, and he was a quasi-mystic, so there are mystical intimations, but he links, this is wonderful. There's a direct link between the 10 plagues and creation. Because in Pirkei Avot, we learn, Ba'asara ma'amarot nivra ha'olam. With 10 statements, Vayomer Elohim Yehi Or, 10 times God says in the creation story, that brought, creation occurred because of God's speech. Asara ma'amarot. Pharaoh's world, Pharaoh undid the world of creation of 10 statements. That's represented by the 10 plagues. So the 10 plagues are the undoing, represents symbolically Pharaoh's undoing of the 10 statements of creation. So the world itself was destabilized. The world is destabilized by arrogant rulers who abuse their people and their resources. You know, does this resonate? Do you hear what's going on in the world today? Do you see what's happening in the behavior of some rulers today, or of even our rulers that we had here in the United States itself, who believe that it's all about them and who therefore have the right to do anything because it's all in service of the great good, which is them, and not understanding that the great good is beyond them, needs to be beyond them. So Pharaoh undid a world that was created with 10 statements, that's symbolically represented by the 10 plagues, right? And the world will be resurrected or restored. Tikkun, the tikkun to the world that was destroyed by the 10 plagues, symbolically, is going to be attained through the 10 commandments. Because the 10 commandments give a new structure to human existence. The basic understanding is that a world made up of masses of human beings needs to have a legal order in order to place limits on people's excesses and to direct them to the good. So symbolically, we have a world created with 10 statements, undone, represented by Pharaoh, symbolically represented by 10 plagues, and then restored, or the attempt, the program for restoration is through the 10 commandments. Now, it's not, I hope you know that I don't mean to say that Israel, that the Jews are the only ones who can restore the world, but it's about purposeful living, to understand that we're living not only to satisfy ourselves, there's something beyond that we attempt to achieve, and it's not only about us. And so that Judaism is not the only religion that can propel us in that direction, but it helps us understand why symbolically the plagues are represented in this excessive manner. Especially the 10th plague comes into light here, because life itself was undermined by Pharaoh. That's what it means. And the most intimate life, that is one's own child, one's firstborn, was undone. Pharaoh killed his own, symbolically, Pharaoh killed his own child. He made it impossible to sustain that life in Egypt, and it came tumbling down. It came tumbling down on top of it. Now, finally, I'll tell you what else is in your sheets, because you can all, I think that Sarah and Andrea can send you, or it's in the chat, right? Sarah, you put it in the chat, the sources, so you can print them out yourself. What you have here is an ancient text that reflects historically on an episode in Egyptian history where there seemed to have been plagues, not completely dissimilar to some of the plagues that are represented in the plague narrative. But I have to tell you that I am never interested. I'm not really interested in scientific explanations or even historical this type of association that precisely explains the Bible in terms of what of real facts, because I think the Bible speaks symbolically, and it may frame real episodes, but it uses symbolic language to present human experience, so that what we get from the stories are values rather than historical fact. It's a different type of truth. It's not a truth that's determined by facticity. It's a truth that's determined by value. And I would say to you, by the way, that truth that's value truth, hopefully has legs, meaning it's longer lasting than truth that's established by facts. Because facts are here, you experience something, then it's gone. And it isn't necessarily something that you learn from a fact. You learn from the values that you derive from the experiences that you have. All right, so that's a general premise. I want to come to my conclusion. Now, all of this came together for me, interestingly enough, in a speech that was delivered by Václav Havel at UCLA in, what year was it? I forget, 1991. I heard the speech. And it was unbelievable to me because it was presented in Royce Hall. Royce Hall was packed. I don't know whether you all remember who Václav Havel it was. He was he was the one who brought the Czech Republic, or at that time Czechoslovakia, out of the Soviet, thinking about Soviet domination. He brought freedom to the Czech people. He led was his revolution called the Velvet Revolution, or the revolution? Was it? I think so. And he was a playwright. He was a playwright, and he emerged as a political leader. He became the first president of the Czech Republic after the Soviet Union, and he had a worldview that I think is so worthy of sharing. He said the following: the communist rulers of Czechoslovakia operated according to the all or nothing principle of après nous le déluge. Hoping that no one would notice, they secured absolute power by bribing the entire population with money stolen from future generations. Miners extracting low-quality brown coal from strip mines, coal that was then burned without filters, were grateful for the chance to buy VCRs, and exhausted after a day's work, eyes glued to the screen, they failed to notice the pus flowing from the eyes of their children. Their wives noticed. Après nous le déluge is the principle of a person who is related to no order, but that of his own benefit. Aha! It is the nihilistic principle of a person who has forgotten he is but a part of the world and not its owner, of a person who feels no relation to eternity and styles himself master of space and time. You know people like that? I believe that the devastation of the environment brought about by the communist regime is a warning to all contemporary civilization. In other words, Poland was the breadbasket of Europe before communism. As a result of communism, Poland became a basket case. All right? Poland, the fields of Poland yielded the grain, the industrialization without regard for what was being done to the environment ruined Poland naturally, agriculturally, and economically. I believe you should read, and it ruined the people. Health-wise, I believe you should read the message coming from our part of the world as an appeal against all those who despise the mystery of being. Right? You need a sense of mystery to know that you're not in control, whether they be cynical businessmen with the only interest of their corporations at heart, or left-wing saviors high or cheap on cheap ideological utopias. That was the communists. But we have left-wing saviors and right-wing saviors. Both lack something I would call a metaphysical anchor, that is, a humble respect for the whole of creation and a consciousness of our obligation to it. I mean, as a rabbi, I couldn't say anything more religious, more meaningful than what Václav Havel said. I mean, the words are so important. Then he writes, were I to encapsulate the experience in one sentence, I would formulate it as follows. If parents believe in God, their children will not need to wear gas masks to school, and their children's eyes will be free of pus. All right. So when I heard that in Royce Hall, I thought that the Mashiach had arrived, because you don't talk about God in Royce Hall at UCLA. But what he meant to induce is something that we've stressed here. What does he mean by God? Humility, human humility. But that's the point, a sense of humility. If you look at what happened in regard to the pandemic, it's parallel to what has occurred throughout history. the arrogance of the Chinese, who were concerned about their economy, allowed them to disregard the consequences and cover up what was going on initially to protect themselves and allow the epidemic and the virus to be unleashed in the world itself. They didn't care. And eventually you see what happens. It comes back to eat away at you anyway. You can't control it. The effort to control out of arrogance. The question is, did our leadership do the same thing and try to cover up initially and not warn us in advance so that the consequence is that 1 million Americans have died? Can you imagine, when someone proposed that number, I remember them talking about it a couple years ago, it sounded absolutely ridiculous, outrageous. That's what happened to us because we did not recognize that, and we weren't humbled by what was overtaking us, and didn't sense the interrelationship of humans and nature, and we're going back to causes now. The encroachment of humans on nature and the closeness with which humans live with all forms of animals allowed that market in Wuhan to be the source of a virus that then spread to human beings. So we need to be extra careful today because our world and the natural world are so close, and we need to preserve a sense of respect for the natural world. And we need to know when there's a need, when we have to preserve some distance and limitations, because the more that we abuse the natural world, the more that we have no regard for the natural world, the worse it becomes for human civilization. So the consequence or the outcome, the Musar Haskell, what we learn from the plague narrative is that we human beings are ultimately responsible for the world in the way in which we behave. And if we don't develop and nurture this sense of respect for our environment and for one another, and understand that respect for environment and respect for other human beings are linked, as we learn in Vayam Shamoa, then we are the only ones who are responsible for the destruction around us. So we have a lot of work to do. That's all I can say. And I'm open to some questions for the next 5 or 10 minutes, and then we'll come to a close. Any questions, please? You can't all agree with me. I'm gonna stop the share. Okay. Okay. Anyone with any questions? Any?
Chaim, I have a question. This is
Go ahead,
Janet.
please, Janet. Yes, I see.
When you say that our values come from education and practice is the means to it, and how do you explain some of the rigid teachings of the Haredi rabbis? If you're willing to compare and contrast your progressive thinking, and you studied in a yeshiva, and their rigidity. Could you help us understand that?
And I think that we're under an illusion that because people are stringent in their religious behavior, that's really what religion requires. And I think that even though this sounds a little flippant, and I should say it with a sense of respect, but I would say it critically. That who says that Haredism is Judaism? I think it's a distorted form of Judaism. Judaism is meant to be lived in the world. People who, the tendency to see everything as prohibited and to place further and further limitations and to disengage, I think is a rejection of God's creation. That includes, by the way, notions of pleasure. It's not so simple because they're trying to preserve a way of life. But, and perhaps I guess the respectful thing to say is, if they want to preserve their way of life for themselves and continue in that way, that would be one thing. But they're not satisfied with that. interested in imposing that, and not only want to live that way themselves, but I think beyond that, it's true of all religious. You see that in Christianity here in America today, where people with certain beliefs think they have the right to impose all sorts of rules on the American public. That are their own personal behaviors, and not recognize and respect what other religious teachings might say. And I think of the abortion issue in that regard. So I think we have to regard Haredism as a I don't know, as a distorted form of Judaism that certain people adhere to because they want to protect themselves from the temptations of the world itself. But I don't know whether that's why humans created to protect themselves from the world. We were created in the world. I mean, it certainly doesn't make unless you actually believe, which is possible, and that's not a Jewish belief, that this world isn't really what it's about. It's about the next world. That's a terrible thing. That's Gnosticism. I mean, it's not Judaism. I mean, how can you say that? And of course, it's against all that we've been saying here, which is you have to have regard for nature. I mean, that's about respecting the world in which we live in and understanding all the possibilities that we have. It does require, I must say, I like Havel, a certain degree of humility and a worldview in which you see the world as a world of possibility that has been given to us as a gift. And if you can relate to the world as a gift, then you can nurture a sense of gratitude. You can understand your place and see that the things that come to us don't come to us because, we deserve it. We're very fortunate. We are very fortunate, most of us, I would say that way. Do we say it enough times? That's why I don't oppose proclaiming hallelujah too much, not because I think God needs to be praised. I think if we don't say hallelujah, what we do is we praise ourselves, and we need to understand the blessing of human existence. Now, to understand the blessing of human existence is a degree of a countercultural sensibility, because the world doesn't look like it's a place that's blessed at all. So then you have to say, yes, that's true, but that's because we have to bring about more of a sense of blessing. I saw someone say this a couple of weeks ago, and I sort of hit myself. Do we bless each other? We don't do that. We think it's Christian to bless one another. Maybe it's also arrogant. Who am I to bless someone? But there's something to be said about the idea that we offer. I mean, we have to do it in a modest way. We offer you blessings. It's such a beautiful idea that we want to extend part of what we have. We want to extend it to others as well. Now, and people who have that, who share that worldview, have been able to live throughout history with a lot less than we have, and understand that their life is meaningful. Whereas the people in our generation who have abundance are searching for meaning everywhere because they can't find any meaning, because it's all about the pursuit of abundance and about more control and about more power. Right. So since you didn't ask me this, I'll say that one of the failures of Jewish education, it seems to me, is to promote a sense of humility as being a Jewish value that we have to pursue. I don't think that Jews are too good on the humility scale, and we don't talk about it. It's not so easy to talk about. I'm humble. Are you as humble as I am? I mean, how do you talk about it? You model it. You have to model it, and you have to identify it, and you have to look for people that you respect because of their humility. That can have an enormous impact on society. I mean, we're very far away from that, but I think we have to start somewhere. I mean, that's what religion is about. I do think that it's subversive. Religion is subversive if it's taken seriously. It undermines the verities of the assumptions that people live by, rightfully doing so. So do we promote those forms of teaching? Okay.
Amen. Thanks.
I'm a little bit over time. I'll conclude. First of all, I want to wish everyone well. There's a lot. I can say this much: we have a lot to talk about this Pesach. In the Seder, there's no dearth of subjects to deal with, and I always like to say that we should emerge from the Seder with a charge. We have to do something in the world, and maybe even talk about practically what do we think, what do we want to focus on that we need to do as a family, as an individual, or with others. And in concluding my understanding of what I presented today, it's sort of a framework that I used for this teaching is what Abraham says about, I think, that to Abimelech in the Philistine that he encounters. Rak ein yirat Elohim b'makom hazeh. There's no fear of God in this place. So I want us to understand fear of God, not in the lower sense of fear that Maimonides, which Maimonides represents in that chapter that we read, which is fear of punishment, but fear as awe, as a sense of awe, and the grand nature of human existence. So what we need to nurture is a greater sense of that form of yirah, the awesomeness of creation itself, and see fellow human beings as themselves a reflection of that greatness and the blessing that we have in living with one another. So I mean, it's also hard to say these days. We have to try to celebrate amidst all the destruction that's around us. And that's the dynamic of human existence. But when we celebrate, we have to make sure, or try to make sure, that it's a meaningful celebration in which we don't forget what's going on around us. That in fact, it raises our consciousness as to what's going on around us. So take care, everybody, and hopefully we'll learn together soon again. Shalom, shalom lachem. Letraot. Thank you, my friends. Thank you. Okay.